When a young legal secretary disappears after being haunted by recurring dreams of abduction and murder, her unsolved case becomes, and still is, one of the most mysterious in the state of Ohio. An array of compelling possibilities are explored in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up, this episode contains mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. With that being said, this is the revisited and enhanced edition of one of our early episodes, which features the unsolved case of Cynthia Anderson. The original edition was recorded in 2020, and we've revisited and re-recorded an episode on her case in 2025. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening since the early days of Last Seen Alive have noticed, our production and audio quality have improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the best we knew how at the time. However, our best wasn't the best, and we've learned a lot since then. We want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So, we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes. I'm talking totally new recordings with any new info or updates included. And we'll be releasing those new episodes on what were previously our off Mondays. So that means there will be an episode of Last Seen Alive airing every single Monday. It'll alternate between totally new cases we've never covered before, as usual, and revisited and remade episodes on the Mondays in between. Cynthia Anderson, who went by Cindy, was last seen alive on August 4th, 1981. She was 20 years old at the time and lived just a short distance outside of the city where she'd grown up, Toledo, Ohio. There, she worked in the city's north side as a legal secretary at a law office offering services in multiple areas of law, including labor law and criminal defense. Cindy had a passion for books and read any chance she got. Even at work, when she could spare a few minutes in between interfacing with clients and taking care of paperwork, she could often be found with a novel open on her desk. So, when the attorneys she worked for arrived to work on August 4th and saw a paperback romance novel left face down on Cindy's desk, they didn't find that unusual at all. Everything else, though, was off. Cindy was almost always the first to arrive at the office. In fact, she usually worked alone for the first few hours of the day while her bosses were in court. Normally, when they arrived at the office afterward, Cindy was there and already well into her daily work routine. On the day she went missing, though, she was nowhere to be seen. She'd clearly been there. There was the book on her desk, and the lights and the radio were on. She'd also turned on the AC in an effort to stave off the August heat and had prepared her boss's desks for the workday, as she usually did. Her bosses could even smell acetone in the air from a bottle of nail polish remover she'd been using. It was as if they'd just missed Cindy. Despite all this, there was no note on the door, which was strange because when Cindy stepped out of the office, she always left a note on the door. She was very thoughtful in that way and never left anyone to wonder where she was. She also always put the phones on hold when she left the office, but, as her bosses noticed, that hadn't been done either. Cindy's employers knew something wasn't right. Quote, "You knew right away that something was wrong," end quote. James Rabbit, one of the lawyers she worked for, would later tell the Toledo Blade. Quote, "You knew she wasn't coming back," end quote.
That's a really odd statement.
Yeah.
It gives me a little chill on my shoulder.
This might seem like a bold conclusion to jump to so quickly. I totally get what you're saying, but there was more than simple intuition behind his assertion. To give some context, James Rabbit was well aware that prior to her disappearance, Cindy had been worried. So worried that she and her employers had been taking special precautions to protect her against something or someone. No one was really sure exactly what or who. Still, when she was at the office alone, Cindy always kept the doors locked, and her employers had gone so far as to install a sort of panic button beneath her desk, one that she could push that would buzz the store next door, letting them know that something was wrong and she needed help. Now, to put these precautions into context, it is important to note that in 1981, Toledo's violent crime rate, particularly when it came to homicides, was pretty grim. The city's police department had been putting in overtime investigating homicides, even serial killings. In fact, violent crime had skyrocketed nationwide, with homicides, aggravated assaults, sexual assaults, and robberies occurring with alarming frequency. So it's not exactly shocking that a young woman working alone would want to take steps to feel safe.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But the fact that they actually went as far as installing that panic alarm, that is pretty aggressive as far as the precaution goes.
Keep in mind that they did practice criminal defense law. So they are constantly dealing with and interfacing with criminals who may have committed some very serious crimes. And she is a young woman who's alone in the office for hours every day. I would say that was actually a very reasonable precaution to take.
Yeah, when you throw in the criminal defense and her being alone, it does.
Even with context, even with what we know, yeah, it does make more sense, but there was still more to it than that. Cindy wasn't just fearful of what she'd seen on the news or what she'd heard through the grapevine or even necessarily of the office's clients. For several months, someone had been repeatedly calling her office phone, harassing her. No one knows exactly what the mysterious caller said to her, but according to an Unsolved Mysteries episode on Cindy's case, a client of the law office was present during one of the calls. Here's how he described it during an interview for that episode. Quote, "The day before Cynthia Anderson disappeared, I had been in the law offices to pay off a legal fee. She got a phone call. She kind of reacted like maybe it was obscene or something and hung up real quick. And the look on her face, still, I can picture it today. She was scared. She was honestly and sincerely scared. It gives me shivers to think of the look on her face. I went home and I called the police department and asked them to drive by and check on her. Something scared the hell out of her, in my opinion." End quote.
It strikes a deep chord that they were concerned enough to call law enforcement to have them check on her.
Yeah. Now, despite the overall air of strangeness on that August morning, Cindy's employers noted that her car was still parked in the lot outside, although her purse and keys were gone, as if she'd stepped out to run an errand nearby. So rather than calling police right away, Cindy's bosses called her sister, Christine. After all, there were no signs of a struggle. Like Cindy's employers, Christine immediately felt that something was wrong. She knew just as well as the two attorneys did that Cindy was responsible and reliable to a fault. All of the Anderson children had been raised in a deeply fundamentalist Christian household, and Cindy was very religious. She saw her job as an act of service to others, which was something she took very seriously, as if her work ethic were a reflection of her faith. After speaking to Christine, Cindy's employers called her parents, who she lived with. And they were worried too, worried enough to report her missing to police right away. Her dad rushed home from work, and by the time he arrived, there were police cars parked at the Anderson home. Officers had officially launched their investigation into Cindy's disappearance, and they began by speaking with her parents, who mentioned something very strange. Cindy's parents told officers that recently she'd been having nightmares, recurring nightmares that had weighed on her mind so heavily that she'd told her family about them. Every time she had the dream, a strange man would kidnap and murder her. The dreams were dark, especially for Cindy, who an article from the Toledo Blade describes as sweetly naive, profoundly religious, and planning to attend Bible college in the fall. It's easy to imagine that with police vehicles swamping the house, Cindy's family might have feared that those dreams had revealed themselves as premonitions. After speaking with police, Cindy's parents contacted other families from their church and started what they called a prayer chain, and even spoke of establishing a cash reward for information about her disappearance. The investigation was launching into full swing, and Cindy had only been missing for a matter of hours. The seriousness with which her disappearance was treated was indicative not only of the city's criminal climate, but of how completely uncharacteristic it was for Cindy to just up and vanish.
Yeah, it's refreshing because a lot of the times we're talking about these cases and police, they're a little lackluster in starting these kinds of investigations.
Sure, especially in the 80s, but not in this case. Everyone was very on the ball.
It's just refreshing to hear them taking it that seriously, but it also points to, like you said, the criminal climate in that area. And
yeah,
just from the police standpoint and giving it that kind of care and attention, it's a large investigative process.
It's a lot to take on, certainly. And police were immediately aware that everyone who knew Cindy described her as responsible, reliable, quiet, Definitely not one to cause a stir over anything, let alone just walk out on her job and worry everyone. Now, Cindy's sister, Christine, later told Unsolved Mysteries, quote, "At the time of Cindy's disappearance, there were no circumstances in her life that any of us were aware of that would have caused her to have run away. She was looking forward to quitting her job in 2 weeks and going to a Bible college that she would attend with her boyfriend. She was very excited about it," end quote. So this really was something that came truly out of the blue. The rest of the day slipped away in a haze of shock and urgent action. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Cindy, nor did she show up at home or work the following day. Desperate for answers, investigators and family members hashed out the details, big and small, of the day Cindy had disappeared. That morning, she'd skipped breakfast before leaving for work, which was something she'd recently begun doing in an attempt to lose weight. Then she'd headed to the office. People had seen her inside the law office as late as 9:45 that morning, but by the time 10 o'clock rolled around, telephone calls were going unanswered. So whatever had happened to her had very likely happened within that 15-minute window.
It's a very short window of time.
Yes, it is.
I mean, that's good for the investigative process, at least.
Yeah, now her disappearance was discovered a little later when her employers arrived at the office and found the door locked. As we mentioned earlier, they'd noticed a novel face down on Cindy's desk. One of her employers had picked up the book, a romance novel, and had noticed that the book had been left open at a scene where the heroine was abducted at knife point.
I wonder if that's intentional or not.
Well, that's what they wondered, because in light of Cindy's sudden disappearance, that seemed a little unsettling. Was it just a coincidence? Or had Cindy perhaps left the book that way on purpose in an attempt to send a message?
I'm going to go ahead and say that she had a stalker. I'm wondering if the stalker would have put that there as a message.
That's a good question as well. So Jim Rabbit, one of the attorneys Cindy worked for, was the one who picked up the book and noticed the passage it had been left open to. According to what he later told Unsolved Mysteries, that moment when he'd realized the scene was about a woman's abduction on top of everything else strange that he was observing, that was the moment when he'd gotten that bad feeling about Cindy's absence. Actually, in his words, he'd been stricken with a, quote, "sickening feeling that something was wrong," end quote. Days blurred into weeks as the investigation continued, all with no sign of Cindy. Even without any sightings, though, there were plenty of possibilities to explore. Perhaps one of the most obvious was the idea that someone might have been watching Cindy, stalking her. Maybe whoever had been harassing her over the phone had seen an opportunity to abduct her and had seized it. Of note, and perhaps relevant to this theory, is the fact that about a year before Cindy's disappearance, some interesting graffiti had appeared on a wall near the office. It had read, "I love you, Cindy," and had been signed G.W.
Okay, so that's definitely something that can't be ignored or discarded.
Right, in light of her disappearance, it was very suspicious. Now, whether Cindy Anderson was the Cindy that the graffiti had referred to is unknown. During the year she was born, 1961, Cynthia was the 8th most popular name given to baby girls in the U.S., so she certainly wasn't the only Cindy in Toledo.
With the context we have now, it definitely seems potentially pointed.
Oh yeah, if I was an investigator working on this case, this would catch my interest for sure. Now, we also don't know for sure who GW was. As far as I'm aware, that remains a bit of a mystery. There was a maintenance man who worked in the area with the initials GW, though. Police questioned him, but eventually concluded that he didn't have anything to do with Cindy's disappearance.
My mind is, it keeps going back to the clientele, because that's who I think would be most likely to interact with Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
That would also, be calling her and harassing her multiple times at work.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm wondering if it matched any of their clientele, but that's not enough to go on a wild witch hunt.
I would love to know. Unfortunately, I don't. Regardless of whether or not the graffiti had been directed at Cindy or was simply a red herring, the stalking theory was as alarming as it was compelling. I say this because stalking is statistically linked to violence, especially violence against women. While researching this episode, I wanted to share some statistics with you to emphasize the significant link between stalking and femicide, but most of the available statistics reference women who are stalked and murdered by present or past intimate partners. And as far as I know, Cindy was not being stalked by someone she'd ever had an intimate relationship with. But of course, stalking isn't always perpetrated by someone an individual has been romantically involved with. Sometimes the stalker is merely an acquaintance, or, more rarely, a stranger. No matter how you look at it, though, stalking can be dangerous. And for the record, the Bureau of Justice Statistics does definitively categorize unwanted or harassing phone calls as stalking behavior. So, at the very least, Cindy did have a stalker. She was being stalked over the phone. Whether her telephone stalker escalated their behavior into the physical realm is unknown, but a serious concern.
So, with stalking, it takes me back to that same training that I've referenced in other episodes about the strangulation being a pre-violent indicator between intimate partner violence.
Right.
The instructor in that training was very adamant that stalking needs to be taken very seriously as part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Even as you said, most stalking statistics are done by intimate partners, or that's what we have the statistics on, because if it is done by a non-intimate partner, those are a little bit harder to compile stats on.
Right, because they're more rare. They do happen, though.
Yes. Either way, it stands out because that is on the path to a violent interaction. It's on the pre-violence indicator list.
Yeah, totally agree.
So all law enforcement agencies need to take any report of stalking extremely seriously, because it can be one of those indicators, and it can be prevented if proper steps are taken. But in the 80s, they didn't have all of that knowledge, and it wasn't taken as seriously, unfortunately.
That's true.
And yes, those harassing phone calls, we don't know the context or the content of those calls, so they could have even been much darker than we're thinking now.
That's definitely possible. Either way, it seems highly unlikely that Cindy disappeared voluntarily for any reason. Besides the fact that an abrupt and permanent disappearance seems to be at odds with what we know of her character, there are other reasons. Firstly, she left her car behind, and her bank account contained a significant sum of money which was never touched. And from 1981 until present day, Cindy's name and social security number have never been used anywhere by anyone for any purpose. In any case, a month after Cindy's disappearance, an unexpected lead came in when police received a mysterious call from an anonymous woman who claimed to know where Cindy was. More on that next. And now, back to Cindy's story. A month after 20-year-old Cindy inexplicably vanished from the legal office where she worked, investigators received an unexpected lead. An anonymous woman called detectives claiming to have knowledge of Cindy's whereabouts. According to Unsolved Mysteries, a detective working Cindy's case described the woman as fearful and whispering, seemingly very eager to get off the phone. Over the course of 2 brief phone calls, she told the detective that Cindy was being held prisoner in the basement of a white house. She never gave a precise address, but she claimed that both the house and the one beside it were owned by the same family. And although the rest of the family was supposedly out of town, a son, Cindy's alleged captor, was home.
As much as I'm hoping there was useful information there, it's very difficult to prove any of that, unfortunately.
Yes, especially without an address. Or, why wouldn't you at least give a street name if this was true,
Yeah, I understand being quiet, but it doesn't sound like this tipster was in any immediate danger or threat.
No, so, why act like that?
Yeah, it's very strange, and it's not giving law enforcement enough, even if they figured out what 2 houses these were. It's not going to be enough for them to go get a search warrant.
Yeah, despite the vagueness of the tip, police looked into it, of course, and searched the section of the city the caller had mentioned for any 2 adjacent homes owned by a single family, and there were plenty of houses that met the criteria. But the description was just so vague that they were never certain which house the caller had been talking about, and in the end, nothing came of it. Whether the tip was legitimate or just one of the asinine hoaxes that tragic cases seem to attract remains officially unknown, but I have my suspicions. While we're on the subject of abductions, though, there's another disturbing possibility worth mentioning, and that's the possibility that Cindy might have fallen victim to a serial killer. As I mentioned earlier, there were some active serial killers in the area at the time she went missing. Perhaps most notably, between the years of 1974 and 1981, the year of her disappearance, brothers Anthony and Nathaniel Cook terrorized Toledo with a series of racially motivated serial killings and sexual assaults. They targeted white victims, and Cindy was white, by the way, who they brutally beat or shot to death. They also sexually assaulted their female victims.
Definitely reasons to look into this.
Right. According to AP News, the Cook brothers have stated that when looking for victims, they sought out girls and women walking alone in addition to couples in parked cars. They would intimidate their victims with guns, and after killing them, they would abandon their bodies in ditches or the trunks of cars or sometimes empty buildings.
The one thing I'm still questioning about this with this theory, while I think it's still definitely worth looking into, is the stalking aspect of it and the harassing phone calls. It doesn't seem like that was really part of their methodology.
Actually, they were known to stalk, at least briefly, some of their victims. Now, I don't think they went so far as making phone calls, to the best of my knowledge, but still, there was some stalking behavior. And most of their victims were in their early 20s, just like Cindy. There were some exceptions, including a middle-aged man and a 12-year-old girl. Here's the thing about the Cook brothers, though. They were opportunists and targeted victims who they saw walking or sitting in parked cars without witnesses around. They did not, so far as we know, abduct victims from inside of offices or other buildings. That would have been markedly riskier than what they were known to do. Of course, if Cindy had stepped outside for some reason, it's possible that they could have abducted her. Remember, her keys and purse disappeared along with her, so it's possible that she had voluntarily stepped outside, perhaps to fetch something from her car. But then, if the Cook brothers took Cindy's life, where are her remains? All of the Cook brothers' victims' bodies were found. They didn't go to great lengths to hide them. Although it's difficult to rule any possibility out, it doesn't seem particularly likely that Cindy was a victim of the Cook brothers.
It's missing a few pieces there.
It is. Now, a side note, one of the Cook brothers, Nathaniel Cook, the younger one, was actually released from prison in 2018 after serving 20 years for the serial killings and rapes. Although he'd been sentenced to 75 years imprisonment, a common pleas judge decided that he, an offender whose various deadly crimes included the rape and murder of a 12-year-old child, should be released back into society.
Nathaniel Cook is somebody that is completely irredeemable and has no place in society.
Yeah, this is not the kind of criminal that you expect to ever be released back into society if caught. I'm pretty shocked by this.
You would hope the justice system would have the capacity to understand that the clear and present risk that this presents to society.
Right. Now, the family members of some of his murder victims were also shocked, and they pleaded with the judge, giving powerful witness statements at the parole hearing. But the judge, who stated that she had no legal basis to prevent his release and was therefore legally bound to allow it, even if she did not like it, was not dissuaded.
The fact that he was sentenced to 75 years, that should be enough.
Right. Well, often people don't serve their full sentences. It's very common to be released earlier. But with crimes like this is a whole different animal than the charges that most criminals are facing. A serial killer and rapist, this is just inherently offensive.
They are somebody that should be serving out their complete sentences.
Right. None of us would want this person in our community, our neighborhood. Imagine being neighbors with this person, especially if you have kids.
That judge is a disappointment.
At the time of this recording, Cook is 66 years old and living in Toledo's Old West End. And yes, this has certainly caused waves in his neighborhood. But he's there, and so far, to the best of public knowledge, he has not reoffended. Hopefully that will remain true indefinitely.
I mean, he's still extremely capable of it. You can't put it past him.
I would not feel safe if he were in my neighborhood, that's for sure. Now, if you'd like to go down the legal rabbit hole of Nathaniel Cook's release from prison, we've got links to some articles on this episode's page on our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com. The link is in the show notes if you're interested. Moving on, though, another theory, the most popular theory, is that Cindy was killed because of something she knew, something she may have overheard in the very office where she worked. This idea was the product of something that surfaced in 1995. That year, police indicted a group of individuals on major drug trafficking charges. They were all part of one of Toledo's biggest drug trafficking operations and were importing drugs from Texas, Miami, and Chicago. They dominated the illegal drug trade in Toledo. Two of the indicted individuals were of special note. They were a man named Jose Rodriguez and his faithful attorney, Richard Neller. Neller was one of the attorneys who'd worked at the same office as Cindy at the time of her disappearance.
So that's what I've been waiting on, because it feels like this very personal attack. And it does not surprise me that one of the attorneys may have taken a special interest in her.
Right. Now, according to the charges brought against Neller, he, a criminal defense lawyer by trade, played an integral role in a drug ring that included some of his clients. Together, they'd unlawfully distributed large amounts of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. Neller was convicted of 5 felony counts and ultimately served several years in prison before being released in 2002. Unsurprisingly, he was also disbarred by the Supreme Court of Ohio. Considering that Neller was not just defending local criminals in court, but conspiring with them to commit further crimes, many people think that Cindy may have been unlucky enough to have overheard one of those discussions in the office. If that was the case, people speculate she may have paid with her life.
I could definitely see it. This is somebody that was going out of their way to conceal crime.
Right, and let me be clear, this theory is not limited to online forums. It's one that police have publicly spoken about, and you can find it bluntly outlined in court documents. Because when Neller was indicted on those drug trafficking charges in '95, the indictment laid out a variety of accusations. And one of those accusations was that Neller, with help from his criminal associates, including Rodriguez, abducted and murdered Cindy. It's in the indictment.
That's a very key piece here. If it's in the indictment, that means that law enforcement was fairly certain of their ability to prove this.
Yeah, well, here's the allegation straight from the indictment. Quote, on August 4th, 1981, Jose C. Rodriguez Jr., Richard Neller, and other persons known to the grand jury but not indicted herein, abducted and murdered Cynthia Anderson, Richard Neller's legal secretary, because she had overheard conversations wherein Jose C. Rodriguez Jr. and Richard Neller had discussed armed robberies and their expanding drug business, end quote. Here's the thing, though. Despite these allegations being boldly outlined in the indictment, Neller was never charged with Cindy's abduction or murder, nor were any of his associates. No one's ever been charged despite these accusations, which must have been incredibly frustrating for her family to know that law enforcement firmly believed this, but that nobody was being charged. In 1995, the News Messenger, a Fremont, Ohio newspaper, published an article in which they stated that according to investigators, Cindy's case was nearly solved. The article then went on to describe Neller being a suspect and intimated that he might soon be charged in relation to Cindy's disappearance. The article also described a pond located in suburban Perrysburg, Ohio, which is just southwest of Toledo. Cindy's dad was quoted in the article saying that investigators told him that they believed Cindy's remains, and probably the remains of several other people as well, were concealed there. However, despite searches, no remains have been discovered. Without remains, any charges regarding Cindy's presumed murder would hinge on a difficult-to-obtain no-body homicide conviction. Prosecutors apparently have decided not to go for it.
I really do feel for the law enforcement here because that is a tall order. And it's not like you're going up against somebody that doesn't know the law.
Right, exactly.
You have to be very confident going in to be able to even attempt that. However, I really wish that they could go forward with it.
Yeah, no-body homicide convictions are very difficult to obtain, and there's just no physical evidence in this case. I mean, could you find physical evidence of Neller and Rodriguez having been in the area where Cindy was abducted from? Yeah, they were there all the time, but that was normal. So this would be tough.
It would be extremely difficult to prove this.
Now, when it comes to this theory, I can't help but wonder whether the intimidating phone calls Cindy had been receiving at the office might have been part of it. We know that Cindy was terrified leading up to her disappearance and that the harassing phone calls likely contributed to that terror, but we don't know what was said. She didn't disclose that to anyone. So what if, rather than the calls being sexual in nature, as some have perhaps assumed, the calls were threats from people involved in the drug trafficking operation we just discussed? What if they were threatening her with great bodily harm or death, and the calls were a means of keeping her too scared to report what she'd overheard until they were able to take her out of the picture altogether? Certainly, this could explain why Cindy had been locking the doors, asking for a panic button, and had been plagued with nightmares of abduction and death around the time of her disappearance. It seems possible that Cindy knew exactly how much danger she was in and was just trying to keep it together and make it through the final days of her employment at the law office as she looked forward to escaping to college in less than 2 weeks' time.
The timing there is nothing but predominant. Because if this is the correct theory, that the closer she gets to leaving, the less control he would have over her. And the more pressing dealing with this potential leak would have to be for him.
Right. Once she went off to college and wasn't in the office anymore, she wouldn't be so easy to lay eyes on or to keep under his thumb. Yeah. It seems like somebody didn't want her to make that escape to college.
And there's no telling who she could tell at that point. There's way too many loose ends. He would have to cover it up before then. And so within the 2 weeks when he knows that her final days are coming, it seems like that was probably the trigger they were waiting for.
I suspect the exact same thing. Now, when we recorded our original episode on this case, Neller was living in Toledo, a free man. He had been for many years. He really didn't serve that much prison time. However, recently, in May of 2024, he died. As for his partner in crime, Jose Rodriguez, at the time of this recording, he's 70 years old and has been in federal prison ever since his drug trafficking conviction back in '96. In 2001, Rodriguez told investigators that he had information about Cindy's death. According to court documents, he, quote, indicated that he had spoken with 2 persons responsible for her death. He also stated that he knew where her body was, end quote. However, he refused to tell investigators what he knew unless they bargained with him, granting him significant legal favors. He told them that he wanted his son, who had also been imprisoned on drug trafficking charges because it was a family business, to have his sentence reduced. As for himself, he wanted authorities to place him in a witness protection program. Now, investigators refused his demands, and according to court documents, quote, not getting what he wanted, Rodriguez remained silent and has remained so to this day, end quote. In 2020, Rodriguez applied for compassionate release, arguing that he should be released from prison because of his age and assorted health problems, which put him at an elevated risk for serious complications if he were to contract the COVID virus.
I hope they took his silence into consideration when they reviewed this.
Oh, they did. The U.S. District Judge who presided over the motion, the Honorable James G. Carr, denied Rodriguez's request for several reasons, which he outlined extremely clearly in a court document we've linked to on our site. One of the reasons he denied Rodriguez's motion was Rodriguez's refusal to tell investigators what he knew about Cynthia's presumed murder. Here's how the judge worded it. Quote, had Rodriguez shown some measure of compassion in 2001 for Cynthia Anderson's family, had he told the police then what he professed to know, he now would have offered at least some reason to consider whether to grant his motion. Seeking compassion from me, he should, when asked, have had some of his own. He has not, and still does not. End quote.
Okay, so I can see why you called him honorable when you talked about him.
Very honorable. I love this judge.
This is amazing, and I absolutely love this judge. That is exactly the kind of thing that you hope for when you're dealing with these very violent criminals that just hold on to something. You never know when it's going to come back to bite you. And it very rightfully did.
Absolutely. And, there's even more to it. It's all very eloquently worded. If anybody wants to read that legal document, again, we've linked to it on our site. And yeah, I bet this judge would not allow a serial killer and rapist to be released back out into society, for the record. Now, more than 40 years have passed since Cindy's disappearance, and there's never been any sign of her. Just 2 years after her disappearance, her mom died of cancer, having never received answers regarding what had happened to her daughter. Her father, who eventually lost 2 wives during his lifetime, died hoping and praying that Cindy would somehow reappear and sweep back into his life. He never moved from the family home and never changed his phone number. He wanted Cindy to know exactly where to find him should she ever return. According to reporting for the Toledo Blade, he held out lifelong hope that Cindy was somehow alive but had been suffering from amnesia and would one day remember the family longing for her return. But that never happened. He never got to see his daughter again, never got to have his questions answered, and never got to see justice served. In the present day, Cindy still has other living family members, and they're still waiting for answers. So please don't underestimate the importance of any information you may have related to this case, no matter how small. The right tip may be just what investigators need in order to finally solve this case. If you know anything about the disappearance of Cynthia Anderson, please contact the Toledo Crime Stoppers at 419-255-1111. You may remain anonymous if you wish. And if you prefer to submit your tip online rather than over the phone, you can do so via the Toledo Police Department's website, toledopolice.com. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Kelly Howard. Her case is not related to Cynthia's, but like Cynthia, Kelly vanished inexplicably from the office where she worked, and abduction is strongly suspected. We aired our episode on Kelly's case in May of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Cindy's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dub Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.